Again, thank you so much for joining us. And today we are starting our webinar series. This one, as most of you know, is around supporting our middle and high school newcomers, as well as students with limited or interrupted formal education. So I just want to begin today by just giving a few housekeeping items, get those out of the way, and to let you know that we are recording this webinar. So be sure and look out in your email for a recording of this session, along with some free resources to help you support your secondary newcomers. Also, anytime you may have questions throughout the webinar, feel free to use the Q&A. We do have somebody here that is manning that Q&A, and they'll answer your questions as they come in. So now let's have our panelists introduce themselves. So I'm really excited that we have three amazing educators that have a multitude of experience, literally decades. And so what I want to do is just to ask each panelist to introduce themselves, the district that they come from, their role, and a little bit about the secondary English language learners that their district supports. So I'll start with Joy.
Hi, my name is Joy Sanfilippo. I am in the state of Florida. My school district is Flagler County. We are a mainstream English district, so we have secondary students spread over our schools, and they are mainstream throughout, and I support teachers from the district level with our newcomers. I was a language arts and reading teacher in the school district for 13 years before I moved into the district level position.
Excellent. Thank you, Joy. All right, so next I'll have David introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. My name is David Noyes. I come from Long Beach Unified School District. I've had the amazing opportunity to work with multilingual learners or English learners for over 31 years. I've worked in different capacities as a classroom teacher, as a dual immersion teacher, an ELD coach, and coordinator, as well as an ELD teacher. So I've just been really lucky to have so many amazing experiences in working with English learners.
Awesome. Thank you, David. And last but of course not least, Shanaz, if you want to introduce yourself.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shanaz Wadwania, and I serve as the Language Acquisition Coordinator at Pleasanton Unified. And prior to coming into this role, I was I was the principal and English language arts teacher and instructional coach. So I've been in this for over 2 decades now, and happy to be here.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop sharing just so we can see everyone and move into our questions. So what I want to let you know is we have 3 questions that we're going to ask our panelists. And these questions really stem from common themes and challenges that we hear from really across the country, from our schools and districts. So the first question is around what types of things should we be taking into consideration as we evaluate the unique needs of our newcomer students? So first, I want to ask David if he could address this question.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Well, first off, I think it's important that we recognize that our newcomers they're not a monolith. They come in with varying degrees of language proficiency and educational experience. So we don't want to just think of them as one composite group. With that being said, I think the first thing that's important, especially for me as an ELD teacher, is I want to look at their typology. What was their primary language? What was their primary language background? I'd want to know if their primary language is Latin-based or comes from a different script. With that helps me determine the types of resources that I would need. For example, in my classroom, I had multiple languages represented. So some of my students that didn't have a Latin-based language where the transfer was there, I really had to understand what foundational English skills needed to be provided to really provide those students with the base of the English language that really got them started on the trajectory of language proficiency. The next thing I would consider is, are these students' basic needs being met? Do they have food? Do they have clothing that will help them acclimate to a secondary school environment, middle and high school? Um, I think that is really important. And in my district, we had the resources to support them. And I think without those basic needs being met, it's hard to be able to actually provide instruction for those students and just really creating a safe environment for those students. Lastly, I would want to make sure that my students had the resources they need to acclimate to a new school environment. So, for example, in my classroom, I paired my students with a language buddy. Whether or not they spoke the same language, but with somebody that would just kind of help them feel comfortable in the school, environment, walk them around the school, show them the different areas of the school that they may have never experienced in their lives, so to speak. And then lastly, for me, I would give my students an entire walking tour of the campus. I would show them where everything was at. I would introduce them to the personnel there, just to kind of really lower that affective filter for those students. And I would provide pictorial input and just really help them make those connections.
That's great. Thanks, David. Joy, would you like to add on to that question or some of your perspective?
Sure. I'm just adding on a big part maybe would be to reach out to the families with a welcome call and try and build a relationship with them. It would reveal to them that there's a desire to build positive relationships in this new environment and show the parents that their child is valued. In turn, that kind of can give us insight to what the student may be coming into the building, carrying through. Getting to know a little bit about the family helps facilitate a comfort level for the student.
That makes really good sense. Yeah. Thank you, Joy. Anything else, Shanaz, from your perspective?
I agree with what David and Joy have shared, and I would just like to add 3 quick points. Now, when you're looking at secondary English learners, then you also want to be mindful of their level of independence, right? They're not very young, they don't need that much hand-holding, and they're developing their self-concept. So when we look at some instructional activities, we want to make sure that it recognizes their needs. And that's why, some activities that work for elementary grade students usually don't work for secondary because they find it very childish. So I'm always mindful of that. Second is because, we get students, particularly in high school, coming from different countries and different cultures, they also have some responsibilities at home, which may not be very typical of students who are integrated in the American society. So they might be taking care of their younger siblings, they might have a job, their parents might be working 2 jobs. So when we understand that, we can also design support systems, keeping that in mind, that they have more responsibilities than what a normal school-going kid in America does. And last point I want to make is the peer influence. At that age, they want to look good in front of their peers. They want to peers are more influential than their teachers. So how can, as an instructional leader, or how can, as a principal or a coach or a teacher, you can leverage that and create a community of strong language models around those students, so that way they have that positive influence.
That's great. Oh, thank you, everyone. Those are really great ideas all around. Our next question is really around multi-proficiency classrooms. So by this, I mean, something that we hear a lot is when there is a designated ELD class, oftentimes teachers may have multi-proficiency levels. Let's say they have proficiency levels 1, 2, and 3. In addition, they also have newcomers in that class. And then furthermore, they're getting newcomers in throughout the entire school year. So in your experience, what is a successful way to be able to manage this? And I want to start this time with Joy.
I really have to say that a profound statement was made to me my second year of teaching by my principal. I was a reading and ESOL endorsed 7th grade teacher. And I had a reading block with English learners of all levels, many languages, and I was just unsure how to dive in at that point. And she just said to me, just teach them English. And I thought, how can I reach these middle school kids and help them become successful more than halfway through their K-12 years? They're so behind everyone else. And well, basically what I learned first and foremost, it's essential to know your students and their data. So conducting that initial placement test for the newcomers really helps reveal a student's level of English proficiency, but it's also important to remember that they don't all come in with no English. So with that in mind, it aids in gravitating where they can be enriched and at the same time be assimilated into the culture of the United States, because culture plays a huge role in how a student may respond in an academic setting. As the students are streaming in, it's not only the academics that they're dealing with, they're socially adapting to a new environment. So taking in these factors kind of brings me to the next point, which is to be planned and prepared in those classroom settings. With newcomers especially, I found that the gradual release model works really well because the students grow differently and all students learn differently. So the whole group explicit instruction is that springboard to assimilate them. And yes, you know what? The newcomers, they might just be copying, listening, observing. But with that stated, you bring in those small groups. This is where that deep intervention takes place at that student's levels. In groups is where that tailored instruction based on the current need happens. So while that small group magic is taking place, have a solid resource that offers further interaction with language development, because this is going to allow the student to just continue with that individual growth while the teacher is working with others. It also enables the student to get a fair shot with multiple learning modes, as well as creating that positive, classroom management for yourself. Of course, as they're in groups, you do have to come back. So bringing everyone back together to summarize some of that class time with that explicit interaction and summarizing of all those instruction points, but together allows for the students to be immersed again with all the levels of proficiency so that they see where they are headed, where they can grow and be with peers. As the district ESOL instructional specialist now, over the past couple of years, I have noticed a steady influx of newcomers throughout the year in our district, and dedicating one class a day at the secondary level that just is for English language development creates a safe space for those students to focus on overcoming their primary academic hurdle, which is language development.
Right. Excellent. Okay, thank you very much, Joy. Shanaz, would you like to add on to that?
Yes, I like the way Joy really presented her ideas in detail. I would just like to add a couple more points. Number one is definitely in a multi-proficiency level, it's very important for teachers of English learners to know where students are in their language acquisition trajectory. So social language listening and speaking develops first, and reading and writing takes some time. And they need to be exposed to all 4 domains of language. So when teachers know this, then they can help with grouping. Sometimes it helps with similar grouping. Sometimes you want language models. And sometimes you need a lot of scaffolds for writing, like sentence stems. For speaking also, particularly with academic language, you need structured, substructured talk strategies, right? So these strategies are good for all students in general, knowing that we are coming out of COVID and students have had some learning gaps. It's very important that the teachers use strategies that are almost for all the students with special focus on ELs. What will work for EL usually will work for everyone. So making sure that what language trajectory students are on, and then deciding strategies. Second, the most important point I want to request all the educators who interact with language learners, that it's very important that we hold them to the same standards and provide the supports rather than lowering the standards. Because lowering those standards actually have a lot of adverse impact as they go through the school system, because then they lack skills, they lack the knowledge they need to be successful in high school and in the real world. So rather than, and we do this out of goodwill and good intent, like we want to help them, we want them to feel successful. But instead of lowering the bar, we need to put some steps in so that way they can reach the bar and not are on par eventually with other students, native speakers.
Thank you very much, Shanaz. And David, would you like to add anything?
Sure, just to kind of piggyback on what both of my amazing presenters said, understanding the varying levels of language proficiency in my classroom was really important. And not just identifying those students with a number, but really understanding what each proficiency level represented, what language skills they were demonstrating, what language skills they needed additional support in. And so what I did was I really tried to organize my classroom for small group and whole group instruction. And part of that meant for, my newcomers, again, just to piggyback on foundational skills, but having that opportunity for small group instruction around foundational literacy skills for English, really getting those really important skills under their belt before moving them on or progressing them into higher or more advanced language skills. For my students that were at intermediate levels of proficiency, I had them working in pairs and groups as well. Maybe they're working on asking and answering questions, summarizing, paraphrasing, all of those things that apply to multiple content areas, but really elevating those opportunities to apply those skills. And then lastly, I always brought my students back, just to go back to what Joy said, for whole class instruction, because I really feel that the language models in my classroom, whether they were higher, I had some students demonstrating higher levels of proficiency in some areas, but I had these language models in my classrooms that I was able to rely on in order to provide some of that really succinct opportunities for using language, but really keeping that effective filter low. So they were able to feel like they can apply those skills, practice those skills in an environment where they felt accepted and able to take chances or be challenged by the English language.
Thank you. Gosh, I'm learning so much from all three of you with so many great suggestions. We have one final question, and this question is really, again, I've heard it many times over the last year or two, just around in an environment where like a school or district really doesn't have too many English language learners or newcomers, and it doesn't really warrant having a designated class. So in essence, those students are put in the mainstream classes from ELA and math and science right alongside their native speakers. And so my question is, how can an ELA or math science teacher really provide differentiated instruction for these students while also really maintaining and addressing the needs of the entire class? So I want to start with Shanaz for this question.
Thank you. So before I discuss strategies, I want to talk about the mindset, right? So we know that we focus on newcomers and students who are new to English, but essentially all of us are language learners. So again, referring to my previous point, what works for newcomers also mostly works for other students as well. So with that in mind, I also want to talk about another piece of mindset, that as teachers, we want to really take on more responsibilities and do everything. And yes, we do feel responsible for the progress of these students. I want to encourage teachers to think outside the box, that they don't have to do everything. What I say is, leverage the community around you. So the most important part of the community is their peers. So as a high school language arts teacher, when I had newcomers, I would actually pair them with peer mentors. Not only it was helpful in that class, but they had somebody to talk to at lunch. They had somebody who could show them the classroom, talk about different classes and teachers, and build that kind of connection. So it is very important that they have some direct connection, and students who are supporting and kind of providing that peer mentorship also get an opportunity to be leaders. So it's like a win-win situation. And that way we can also make sure that there is this understanding that newcomers will actually be accepted and it's part of it. And what is our responsibility as the main members of the community, how we can help them integrate. So leveraging peers is one of the strategies. Second, of course, we have mentioned in the other two answers is that creating a safe environment. Because, English is my sixth language. And when I go in different environments, I'm still, even after such a high level of education, I'm silent, I'm observing. So what I really feel, when I feel really comfortable, is when somebody says, hey, Shanaz, what do you think? We would like to hear from you. Or if the language is a barrier, can you write? Or, if you want to use a translator. So just have that patience and invite participation and make that a point that we are seeing you, we are hearing you, and we value what you have to say. And that has to be intentional. Otherwise, newcomers tend to kind of disappear in a corner, or they are just there and no acknowledgement, because we are like, oh, teachers usually say, oh, they don't have language. I mean, they don't have English language. They do have their heritage language. So how are we accessing the knowledge that they have acquired through that language? So giving them, again, another strategy to access and involve them is to give them different options and show to demonstrate their learning. It always doesn't have to be in English, particularly in history and other subject classes. We are looking at conceptual understanding of the content and not so much of the language acquisition. So we want to understand the objective and purpose of these classes and then create activities and give them opportunities to really express their learning in different ways. Like I remember teaching Macbeth, and I had about 10 newcomers in my class, and it was very challenging. The language itself is challenging for the native speakers, Shakespeare's language. But then what we did was we divided the class into 5 groups. One group got each act, and there were balanced groups, and they created visuals, and we had like graphic novel kind of, they had freedom to create a visual graphic novel or whichever medium they wanted to present. And then at the end of it, we had these 5 acts visually displayed in the class where everybody felt involved, they had something to contribute, and they were understanding their portion of it. And we all got like, who's memorizing Macbeth? We just need to understand the big ideas. So trying to incorporate and making sure that there is intentional, and as I mentioned in my previous response, that we don't want to dilute rigor, but we want to create scaffolds and support for them to be able to reach that. Third point I want to make in terms of strategy is that it's very important for language learners to get feedback on their language acquisition as well. So there are levels and there are trainings and there are different models that we use in different states, but we want to make sure that we recognize that they are making an effort and then push them to the next step. If they are speaking in 2 or 3 in like a short sentences, then encourage them to use conjunction, then encourage them to make it a complex sentence. So it's like your video game, you are pushing them to go to the next level and try. And the last thing is, probably these subject teachers need to actually understand and get trained in how to design language goals and content goals. So then it makes it very seamless when you're teaching the content that you are also focusing on the vocabulary, on some, I would say, purposeful sentence structures and what is the function of the language in that particular context of their activity. So this part gets very technical, and usually it's important that teachers kind of spend some time and the district spend some time to get teachers trained. So how can they kind of embed language goals within the content areas? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shanaz. And I want to get David and Joy's input on that question as well. Also to let everybody know, we've got some questions in the Q&A. So after David and Joy provide their input, we do want to go through a couple of questions. So David, was there anything else you'd like to add on?
Yeah, my experience when I was an EL specialist, I was able to push into other content area classes where teachers had a representation of multilingual learners there. And one thing that I thought was really important to point out was the difference between sheltering content and teaching English language development. So I really had to support the teacher in understanding that these students had an ELD class where they were taught explicit English language development, but sheltering was different. It was really around allowing access to the content and scaffolding that. And so when I worked with my teachers, we talked about different types of strategies that they were able to fold into their classroom instruction, additional pictorial input, identifying cognates. So there's words that in a Romance language where they basically have the same spelling, meaning, they sound the same, and English, let's say English and Spanish or English and other Romance languages, just showing the teacher that they can identify words like that, and it creates instantaneous comprehension for those students that do have some of that language transfer. I talked about Google Translate, and I know that teachers were oftentimes, they weren't always comfortable with just providing the students with Google Translate, but what I mentioned to them is when students are navigating through dense English texts, Google Translate teaches kind of the essence of what the students are learning. And so it's not necessarily a crutch, it's an asset. And what I found was this gives students agency. They learn how to kind of adapt and understand the content that they're learning in another language and use those tools effectively. Grouping was another thing. I always made sure that the students, the teacher understood that having a language buddy or students that speak the same primary language if possible, in the classroom. It's important for them to be able to go back and kind of debrief around what they learned using their primary language, just to kind of reinstate some of those ideas or reflect on some of those ideas or difficult concepts that they were learning. You know, and lastly, I just want to say that providing opportunities for, we don't, again, to go back to what Shanaz said, providing opportunities for the students to be involved in the classroom experience instead of putting them in the corner and thinking that through osmosis they were going to pick these things up, but really making them active participants in their language development. I think that, you know, by providing additional opportunities for language paraphrasing, restating, summarizing, discussion, classroom discussion, paired discussion, helps them really pick up on the assets around English, that in a sense that once that language veil is lifted, you're right where you want them to be. You provided those opportunities for them.
Great, thank you, David. Joy, would you like to add anything from your perspective?
Sure, I'll just add one small thing. David and Shanaz gave such a great description of this question. Recently, I conducted a training session for middle school content subject teachers. You know, a lot of times we focus on language arts or reading class, but with English language development, but these teachers see these students all day long. And one part that was essential was the role of the academic vocabulary. And, you know, before and during lessons, teaching that explicit vocabulary instruction, empowering the students to advocate for themselves through the learning of those Greek and Latin roots. With so many of our language, especially our academic language words, use those Greek and Latin roots across subjects. So this gives students the ability to be equipped with necessary tools to decipher word meanings independently as they're growing. It's important to note that a lot of the secondary content teachers tend to feel that the vocabulary development primarily occurs in language arts or English class. However, this practice really is beneficial for all students across various subjects, as Shanaz had stated earlier about training the teachers.
Right,
I want
right.
to point out how David brought in the cognates. It fits so well with the Greek and Latin roots that they can work well together to build students' language.
Absolutely. That's great, Joy. I know we're at time, everybody, but I'm hoping if you all have an extra 5 minutes, there are some questions we'd like to address. And Anna, do you want to go ahead and read off the questions and see, you know, which one of our panelists would like to address those?
Yeah, sure. There's a question from Daniel. He asks, is there any tips on teaching the basics like ABCs to middle school newcomers at a developmentally appropriate level?
I can answer that. There are a lot. Foundational skills are foundational skills. So one of the things that I relied on a lot is going and I watched YouTube videos. I watched around just teaching foundational skills, but making it developmentally appropriate for my students. So I honestly, I took out the sing songs and just focused on the basics, but I created a lot of Google slide decks where I was able to kind of unpack, let's say, letter identification, sound symbol relationships, syllables. So I was able to glean a lot of these really creative ideas, but make it appropriate for my secondary students.
Great, thanks, David. I think we could take maybe one more before we wrap up. And just to let everybody know, there are several questions in the Q&A that we really didn't get to, but we will send you an email with the answers because I want to make sure we address all the questions that came up. So please look out for that. But Anna, is there one more that we can, that you think is, go ahead.
So there's from an anonymous attendee, how do you encourage multilingual learners to talk with each other in class when parent share doesn't seem to work?
I can jump in on that question. At our high school level, they are doing an activity through Language Tree Online called I Have, Who Has. And doing these activities, I was able to go into the classroom. I could tell that the students had not been doing this just to show me. This is something they do on a regular basis. And they are interacting with one another, but having a tool in front of them to look at gave them the confidence to be able to speak out. And then having someone else, it's called I Have Who Has Activity. So they were then trying to find the person who had the item that they needed to match to. So giving them tools to be able to speak with for a purpose seems to slowly help them.
Great. Thank you so much, Joy. Well, I appreciate everybody's time and for joining us today, especially our amazing panel. Every time I sit back here and listen, I can learn from all three of you, amazing educators. And I wanted to let you know, for those of you in attendance, if you still have questions or maybe you simply want a thought partner, you can reach out to David Noyes. His email there is posted, and he is chock full of amazing ideas. Also, any questions around standards aligned resources, you can reach out to your language tree representative or simply email support@languagetreeonline.com. And once you log out, you are going to get a pop-up of a survey, and we would really appreciate it if you would just take a minute or two to do this survey, because we'd love to get your feedback. You also may have some great ideas for upcoming webinars, so we would greatly appreciate it. And speaking of webinars, our next one will be on January 23rd. And it's going to be around what are the essential skills that each proficiency level of our multilingual learners should they understand. So thank you again for your time, and everybody have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.